Meg-John, thank you so much for being here. It's so wonderful to see you, to speak with you. For those who might not be so familiar with yourself or with your work, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually a writer first and foremost these days, and I write books for a general audience, mostly about mental health and gender, sexuality, and relationships. But I was quite excited to be considered a notable enough existentialist to be part of your project. So I guess I don't, just focus on existentialism, but my training, my therapeutic training was in existential psychotherapy at the New School at Emmy van Derzen's New School. So that's my kind of link to existentialism. And since then, I've always drawn on existentialism in my work, but alongside a number of other kind of approaches, which I'm sure we'll get into in the interview.
And so did the writing come first and then the therapy training or?
Mm. Well, actually, to be honest, I started in psychology. I've always had a passion to really want to understand, humans and how we work, and also mostly how we suffer and what we can do about that. And my journey started by looking at the self-help books on the on the bookshelf and in the shops, and finding nothing much of help there. So I went to psychology, then into sociology more. So my background's as an academic, studying those kind of areas. And then I decided to train in therapy, but at the same time I was joining a lot of activist communities and learning a lot through kind of activist politics as well, and also became a Buddhist 20 odd years ago. So there was a kind of spiritual element, so trying to just look in all these different places to see what were the answers to why we struggle and suffer ourselves, but also in relation with others. And then trying to join the dots. Really, I think my work's really about trying to synthesize all these ideas and put them out in a way that can then end up on the self-help bookshelves. So I write self-help style books, but also comic books as well, and I've also done some podcasting, so trying to get these ideas across in mediums that are really accessible for people.
And I suppose a
Mm.
really good place to start might be, how do you understand existential ideas? How would you define them or describe them?
Yeah, I think I got a better handle on this today than I would have done last week, because I've just been writing about this, because my next comic book graphic guide is on mental health. And so I was looking into um, the kind of philosophies that understand our struggles at this kind of level of the human condition, which I think, particularly existentialism and Buddhism, like their main thrust is, why do we suffer as human beings, and what is it about being human that makes us suffer, rather than, for example, thinking about the level of, the culture or the social system, or the level of the kind of individual kind of lifespan that psychoanalysis and a lot of therapies look at. Existentialism, Buddhism take that really broad, like, what is it about being human? Um, and I was thinking, like, while I was writing this chapter, like, what are the main bits of existentialism that sort of, what are the main ideas, I think, that explain the human struggle, I suppose. And I think, one of them is this idea that we're born into worlds which already have all these existing meanings, whether that's the level of the family out to the wider culture, but we are free to make our own meanings. But that freedom feels so frightening that we're really drawn to kind of just take on those meanings of the people around us and just kind of replicate those, rather than, having these moments of choice where we realize, oh, it could be otherwise, but then often turning away from those. So that's the kind of key idea, I think, and this sense that also life is uncertain and impermanent, and then we are going to die. And again, that being something that's just so hard to confront, that a lot of people find different mechanisms of sort of turning away from that. And then they become kind of habits that often make us struggle a lot more. So this real sense of, like, in existentialism, about the idea is turn, like, towards the realities of life and really feel that the anxiety that comes with that, but that sort of almost like throughout the other side of that anxiety is greater freedom. So that seems to be a really key idea. And then a sense, I suppose, in the kind of phenomenological method, that the way we need to do this is to really attend deeply to our lived experience and try to get at describing, like, exactly how it is for us, rather than going into these stories or these different habits or these different versions of ourselves that we're trying to put out there, but what's it like to just really turn back in? And that's why I see it having a lot in common with Buddhism, because I think the phenomenological kind of method is quite similar to sort of mindfulness practices in Buddhism. And I think, again, that sort of idea that being the things we do to try and avoid our own mortality and to try and avoid the impermanence of life are the things that actually hurt us. I think those two ideas are pretty similar, although they're kind of expressed in different ways.
And it makes me think, the way that you've described it right here, I'm realizing that we're living this life of suffering, and we're always, if we choose it, there's always something to complain about, something to be in pain about. But at the same time, we don't want to give it up. We don't want to die. We don't want to.
Yeah, that it's really scary. It's such a weird one, that there's so much suffering in all these things that we do. Like we had a moment where the technology was failing a little bit before the interview, right? And it's like we could both so easily get into this, like, oh God, we need to start at this time, and like, you might be thinking, am I letting MJ down? I'll be like, oh, where's this person? And like, just we could add so much on top of, or we could just be like, oh, this is a really, this is a moment to just notice, oh, something's gone off track. Does this, what does this open up for us? There might be there a potential, I did a little bit of meditating in the time. I'm probably actually, a better interviewee now than I might have been half an hour ago, so there's something about, how do we meet that moment, I suppose, and not layer all that struggle on top, but this awful kind of paradox that it requires going towards what feels really painful. So we don't do it, so we do this other thing, which actually is, way more painful than going towards that pain of the anxiety of like realizing life is so uncontrollable and we are free to make whatever meaning we want of it. That's actually sort of a long-term less painful, but short-term it feels like all of these ways of kind of struggling against life and trying to make it come out our way, they feel like they're going to be less painful, and they're not. They're a lot more painful. Yeah.
And I know that you said you gave us a slight journey into how you found yourself among these ideas, but what we can find understandings or messages about why humans suffer and how humans suffer in many different areas. And what was it about the existential and the Buddhist philosophies which really called on you?
Well, I guess for existentialism, the reason I wound up there was I was looking to train as a therapist. I'd always wanted to be. I'm actually no longer a therapist. I always wanted to be. This is a good example. You think that this is a life for you, and then you realize, it's not so much eventually. But I really wanted to be a therapist back in my 30s, and I'd always wanted to train, and I wanted an approach that wasn't pathologizing of mental health. And at that point, it really seemed like the only schools were the systemic schools and the existential schools that had that real non-pathologizing, we don't diagnose and treat people approach. And I didn't really want to do family therapy, and systemic therapy mostly would have sent me down, it wasn't so much the sort of one-to-one and couple work kind of relationship therapy. So again, I went towards existentialism, an existential therapy training. And also I hadn't really studied philosophy in depth, and I'd always wanted to. So it also gave me an opportunity, I already knew a bit about the psychological therapists, so it gave me an opportunity to kind of study a philosophical therapy. Buddhism was more stumbling across it, to be honest. Somebody recommended a book called Buddhism Without Beliefs that was kind of about an agnostic take on Buddhism by Stephen Batchelor, and that just really resonated with me. And then I was happy to discover that when I did the existential training, there was just so much in common, between the two approaches, so it felt like familiar territory.
Absolutely. And I would love for you to kind of share more, if you wanted to, about that synthesis between existential philosophies and Buddhist philosophies.
Yeah. I think, as I said, that definitely that the phenomenological approach and mindfulness seem to have a great deal in common. Like, you're trying to really stay with your lived experience of this moment, right? And constantly you're being pulled away from it to your stories, Pema Chodron calls it your storylines, you know, like, oh, what's this person done? Or like, what have I got to do later today? Or no, I haven't done enough, or whatever it is, you know. And it's like, it's just like back to the, you know, back. And I think, you know, it's kind of like the bracketing and horizontalizing in phenomenology, where you're kind of like, what's my assumptions? You know, what am I layering on top of this in terms of my assumptions? You know, how do I come back to just the lived experience of this moment? And also, how do I horizontalize? How do I treat everything as equally valid and meaningful, rather than latching onto this thing and ignoring that thing? So it's got that kind of similar, like in mindfulness, you're always trying to notice, what am I craving and what am I averse to? You know, what things am I trying to grab hold of and what things am I trying to get away from? And I guess that horizontalizing has a little similar flavor to that, you know, of like treating everything as interesting rather than trying to get all the pleasure stuff and get rid of all the pain stuff. And again, you know, that sense that then with the great anxieties that come up around the big existential things, how we tend to pin those on specific things. You know, I was reading some Irvin Yalom recently that was really talking about how we tend to pin, you know, like that anxiety feeling onto stuff and then grapple with that surface level stuff rather than staying with the feeling. And there's so much in Buddhism about, you know, how do we stay with that groundlessness, that shakiness, that kind of insecurity of existence, rather than, you know, pinning it onto stuff and trying to make those external things or internal things work out right. You know, we get so obsessed with a particular pain in our body or with a particular emotional state or train of thought, instead of being able to just stay with that, like, what is that lived experience of, like, whoa, you know. And again, that's impermanent, you know, so it becomes very solid and fixed, you know, a bit like, I guess, that Spinelli kind of idea of sedimented. You know, we get really, really fixed around things and they feel really solid, and we feel really solid, like we could never be any different from how we are in this moment. And when, again, we do a mindfulness practice or we practice sort of phenomenologically, that you can see how it shifts and changes when you don't try and kind of grab hold of it and make it very, very like permanent.
I suppose indeed your career itself is a really lovely example of that, because you were saying, you know, you had started and really felt that your path would be to be a counselor and to be a therapist, and you had to have an openness to not holding on to that for you to allow you, oh, this training wasn't a waste. It's contributed to my life in a new way, but I've since found some other opportunities that I'm going to allow myself to embrace if they feel right.
That's right, isn't it? Yeah, I think, again, when we can assume that life is this flow, you know, and we're always in a state of becoming, then we can be more open to, you know, those micro events of the day ahead or the macro events. You know, I really felt it today. It's like I've been cracking on with this book writing. It's been going really well. And so I want to do another couple of hours today later on. And I'm feeling a little bit under the weather today. And I'm like, and there's so much in me that wants to keep being that writer, you know, and doing the 2 hours every day that I've been doing and like cracking on. And it's like, I know really, if I rest, you know, if I'm really with my experience of today, this will probably be, you know, enough. And then I really need to take it more gently for the rest of the day and not try and do something really creative, you know. And it's, again, you know, the temptation is so much to fight against, you know, the reality of our experience and to, you know, to be the writer, you know, or to, and same, yeah, like when I did the therapy training, oh, like, I'm a therapist now. I guess, you know, there's a lot in Sartre, you know, about how we kind of make ourselves into these things, you know, and then we have to act as that thing. And I guess, you know, this speaks to my passion around gender and sexuality as well, because, again, there's a real temptation with that to fix yourself as, you know, this particular sexuality, this particular gender, and to be utterly that thing. And actually, you know, the research now is finding that gender and sexuality are fluid for everybody. They change a lot over time. And again, how can we embrace those changes and let ourselves be this unfolding process and not try and fix ourselves? And it really relates to the wider culture, because there's so much pressure, you know, in those areas to be like the ideal of a woman, you know, or to be like, you know, okay, being a gay person means this, being a straight person means that. And it's like, how do we shift again, to a much more existential understanding of how all of those things work.
And I would love for you, if you would like to elaborate a little bit more on your contributions and your understandings here, because I feel it's very, very, it's I feel that I'm born in that kind of like a stepping stone space. So for if I have a conversation with my grandma, she will have she can't get her head around it. She can't connect with it, because for her it's not meaningful, and for her friends and the conversation she's had throughout her life, it's not had any substance for her to understand. But then if I speak to people, maybe my younger cousins, then they are they're like, what is there to talk about? It's fluid, like there is no question.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I'm in a slight stepping stone, but it's not enough spoken about, at least in my circles or for me. So I would love for you to go wild and share. Yeah.
I'm happy to. Yeah. I mean, I guess, yeah, your question about what's my offering, I suppose it's like this twofold. Yeah, like that I do focus in on gender, sexuality, relationships. And so I have something to say about those areas. And when I was writing more in like existentialism and publishing in existential journals, that was the kind of thing, like existential sex therapy, existential relationship therapy. But also I think it's this dialogue for me. It's this very broad brush. It's like, yeah, I just draw on a lot of different schools of thought and a lot of different practices and try and bring them together. And so in this graphic guide I'm writing, it's like, here's the existential approach. Here's the approaches that see human suffering and human relating on that human level of this is the human condition, what we all do. But then within that, there's the cultural level, which is extremely important to understand, like how our particular culture understands these things. It is that world that we're thrown into. And, it's so strong, these normativities about how we should do things like gender and sexuality and, be a mentally healthy person and be successful. They're so strong. We have to look at the sort of systems and structures within our society, and then within that level, there's the relational level, which is more the kind of upbringings that we have in our families and the people around us and the relationships in our life now and how we manifest ourselves in relation. And then within that, there's the kind of internal level of our embodied experience and how these things get, kind of engraved on our bodies and brains, which is a bit like Emmy van Deurzen has this model that's kind of similar of like that we have to look at the spiritual realm, I think, the physical, the culture, the cultural, social realm, the physical realm. So it's got the same sort of four ideas. And I think we have to look at all of those. And I think what I bring is like, I bring existentialism and Buddhism then in dialogue with the kind of social justice ideas, Black feminist thought that really focuses on that cultural level, queer theory as well, Foucauldian ideas, and then also in dialogue with the therapeutic kind of approaches that look at that relational level, like the systemic approaches and humanistic ones, psychodynamic. And then with that, the kind of somatic and embodied approaches, like the kind of more recent trauma stuff that really focuses on that inner level. And how do we bring these different understandings of humans and human suffering and human relating like together so we can get that full picture? I think because I've come in through that lens of gender and sexuality, where you have to understand them on all those levels, like you can't really understand them without knowing what are the cultural norms here, and how do people's upbringings affect, shape their sexuality and gender, and how do those things play out through their body, because they're such embodied things. That's drawn me to have that really broad brush, which means like on any of those schools of thoughts, I don't know all the details. I've not got the in-depth, some people are so good at that, like in-depth, and they're, really kind of know their existential, philosophers, and they've read all the books. I'm a bit more like broad brush. But I think there's space for both of those, right? So does that sort of gives you the broad sense of that question, I guess. But did you want me to talk specifically more about the gender and sexuality piece?
If you would like to, I think it would be, it's up.
Yeah. Well, I think it's so I've written 2 like graphic guides to gender and sexuality, and then 2 self-help guides now called How to Understand Your Gender, How to Understand Your Sexuality. And I think what those are trying to do is again, open this up for people. So it's less of this sense that, you're born this way, right? To quote Lady Gaga, and it's like, that's just, it's all a matter of, are you a man or a woman? Are you gay or you're straight? Like, figure that out, and that's you're born in that way, and then you carry on that trajectory your whole life. And this is how to be a man or a woman, and this is how to be a straight person or a gay person. You're kind of given, again, you're thrown into the world with that given of like, this is it. And actually, no, so much of what we're learning is that, first of all, there's way more to it. There's gender and sexual diversity. So our sexuality is about so much more than like what gender we're attracted to. It's, for a start, we can be attracted to all different genders, or like, it might be more about the body of a person or more about their characteristics. But then also there's just about, what actual sexual practices we enjoy, what sensations do we like, what do we fantasize about, what do we desire, at what level is our sexual interest, from nothing all the way through to really high level. And, all of this stuff, there's just so many dimensions to it. And then that they're constantly in flux and changing. Like, our sexuality is not, even just the people we're attracted to are not the same at 7 years old, 29 years old, at 60 years old. It would be a real problem if they were, the same, right? If we were still attracted to, I don't know, boy bands, by the time we got to 70, it would be a bit odd, right? So these things are really in flux, and they're shaped by the experiences we have through our lives, and also by the wider culture and what that tells us is sexually attractive or interesting, and whether we kind of resist that or whether we sort of fit within that. So yeah, that really it's about like opening it wide to say, and I think that is like, if you take an existential approach to gender, to sexuality, you've got Simone de Beauvoir saying one is not born, but one becomes a woman, right? And that's exactly what I'm talking about. Like, how do we become man, woman, non-binary? How do we become transgender, cisgender? How do we become gay, straight, bi, kinky, asexual? What's that process of becoming? And you soon realize then that everyone's is unique. They all have a unique relationship to gender and sexuality, which is also constantly in flux and changing. And that's to be expected. But how do we loosen this up at a cultural level and at an individual level to help people, again, embrace that freedom and find their path through it that's meaningful to them, and that hopefully leads to the most congruent and comfortable relationship with their gender, that leads to the best kind of sexual experiences, rather than what we currently have, which is so like locked down at every level that many people are really uncomfortable in their gender, in their embodiment, and in their sexuality.
This opening up, not just of a space, a safe space to speak about it, but of an informed space to come from, this feels really, really valuable. But do you feel that you meet controversy, or that this topic meets controversy? Because for me, I don't get why there's a resistance. I feel such a resistance depending who I speak to, even with the media, even like the occasional snarky comment or a look or like a raised eyebrow. I don't understand why.
Well, I think, again, like, probably existentialism can help us a lot here. I suppose there's all these ideas of the sort of crowd, or the kind of that there's a sense of, we're thrown into this world with all these existing meanings, and one answer to not feeling the anxiety of going against those or embracing our freedom is to just conform to it, right? Is to just be like, okay, that's just a given, that's just the way things are. Sorry, I've got a pesky seagull.
I saw it in the reflection. Yeah.
I'm like, go away, it's not the time. So for a lot of people that feels safe, right? Okay, not just, I'm not just saying this is cultural normativity, I'm saying this is the right natural way to be. And we see so much of that around gender and sexuality, and this is how it's always been, which again, historically is not true. These things have changed so much in terms of how they've been understood over time and how they operate in different places. But people want to believe that sense of like, this is how it is. And then the other piece, again, that existentialism offers, I think, is that people want to see themselves as the good guys, and kind of fix themselves as good people. And that, again, it's another way that a lot of the existentialists talk about, that we kind of fix ourselves as a certain thing, and that's a way of escaping, kind of the sense of mortality and anxiety. And so when somebody comes along to question that, that can lead to a lot of, real fear. And again, I think Simone de Beauvoir, is just so good on this stuff, because she's using existential philosophy, but really thinking about gender and really thinking about social constructs as well. And she uses the example of mothers and daughters, of like how hard it is, in her time, for mothers to see daughters having so much more freedom than they had themselves, and that actually mothers might then quite try and restrict those daughters' feelings or freedoms, or say you should be doing things the way I did. And I think we see that a lot in these intergenerational conversations that you were alluding to. It's like, to see other people, you've done things in this incredibly painful way, you've learned this very painful kind of femininity or masculinity that you've had to do, that's restricted you in so many ways. And then you see these young folks going, well, I'm actually going to be this kind of woman or this kind of man, or maybe even the whole gender thing, is like exploded, and I'm going to be non-binary, or, I'm going to transition and be another gender than the one that was assumed for me. Like that, you can see why, from an existential point of view, somebody's like clinging on, that it's so threatening to see, say a younger generation doing that. And that the answer then may be to like blame and get very angry at that generation, or to feel a sense of loss and grief, and existentialism is like offering some solutions here, which is to just embrace the uncertainty and ever changingness of life, and the fact that people are free to make those meanings, and those meanings are going to change over time. But it's understandable why people get very like rigid around it, I think. Very sad, but very understandable.
Yeah. And anger, you mentioned anger. Like, I feel of all themes, there is something angry about people being averse to being open to it, even regardless of whether it relates to their own experience or not. But they angry in reaction to other people's experiences of gender and sexuality.
Yeah, which I guess, again, if you think about, Spinelli's kind of sedimented worldviews, it's where that worldview becomes very fixed. And not only does we have to grab hold of it for ourselves and keep this worldview, but we have to impose it on everybody else, because somebody else doing things different is a real threat. And again, I think, Sartre's stuff about objectification comes in here, that we want people to be an object for us, that we're going to try and kind of fix them in order that they don't fix us, and I think there's that, you definitely see that in the sort of trans debates, the kind of moral panic around trans, that people are fixing trans people as these objects for them to distance from, in order to sort of keep themselves safe. And like really seeing trans people as a threat, even though there's just no evidence, that trans people are in any way kind of violent, or certainly not to higher levels than anybody else, and we saw the same thing in the 80s in the kind of moral panic about gay men, again being presented as a threat to children, to everybody. We see that in almost like every other that's created in our society, they're seen as a threat, even though actually the dominant groups have a lot more power. And I think that kind of process, again, can be explained in that way of like, we want to objectify the other, so that we can distance from that, and say that's not real, or that's a bad thing, also we can justify these really unequal systems that we have, that if we really had to look at them, it would, we'd have to face a lot of pain, a lot of guilt, to how we've conducted ourselves.
Moral panic is that a normally used phrase? I've never heard it.
Oh yeah, no, it's just the moral panics are things that happen like every few years, where the whole society kind of becomes convinced that these are the bad guys, like whether it's immigrants are taking our jobs, or trans people are, gonna like whatever we're gonna do, like sort of explode, dismantle gender in a way that's going to be terrifying for everyone, or
and it feels it's so fitting in this kind of thing. But you alluded to the history of it earlier, and this is something I was going to ask you about. Have you looked into the history of it? Because I think it's very easy to look. It's like, again, referring to like my grandparents' generation, like you know, you have the assumption that the generation that prior to you see that life was just like that beyond it, but it's not the case at all. Like,
No.
what goes beyond that? Like,
Yeah, no, I mean, historically, with gender and sexuality, the answer is that it's changed massive. You know, again, it comes back to the sense of the meaning of the world we're thrown into, and that meaning has shifted massively around those things. So they even talk about the invention of sexuality in the Victorian era, because it changed so radically that suddenly in the Victorian era, people started seeing a sexuality as something you had and made you a certain kind of person. You know, before that, they didn't even have the words homosexual and heterosexual. Like, there wasn't a sense of being a certain kind of person. There were just sex acts, you know, most of them were sinful and some of them were okay, so long as they were procreative. And that was it, you know. And then it was like Victorian era, it's like suddenly your sexuality makes you this kind of person. And we get these really fixed ideas of what it means to be, you know, homosexual and heterosexual, particularly. It gets very, you know, linked to the gender that we're attracted to. Wasn't like that before. It isn't like that in a lot of places, you know.
Indeed, and I was going to say it's probably really it really will change depending on the different culture that you're thrown
So
into.
much.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And again, we have such a, you know, ethnocentric view that kind of the white Western way of understanding these things is somehow correct or normal or natural. And it is just another way of seeing things that we have at this moment. And you could argue one that is particularly flawed, you know, because it does have these ideas of like people being these fixed identities. Yeah, which doesn't really relate to most people's lived experience, let alone how other people see this around the world. Mm.
But yet we those who are born into that culture, we see the world and see ourselves and see our development and understand ourselves through this sense of, you know, I am this, or that is this, and it's like we are driven to find that black or white answer to everything.
Mm.
And I
Mm.
feel that this is where kind of existential ideas can be helpful, or any of the ideas which teach us, hey, step back, you know, let's be
Yeah.
a bit more open-minded, there are other options.
Exactly. And that encourage us to, you know, I'm thinking about Martin Buber and I Thou, you know, that encourage us to relate across difference and to hold the other person in all their otherness and ourselves in all our complexity, rather than that sense of like trying to make everybody like us in order to keep safe, you know. Yeah, I think it offers a lot. But I do think, you know, existentialism in focusing so much on the human condition can really miss some of that cultural layer, you know, that it makes it so much more likely that we do this stuff because our culture is so like binary thinking, is so kind of us and them hierarchical, that it makes it much more likely that we're going to do these things. So I do think we need to bring the existential analysis, you know, into dialogue with more intersectional analysis that looks at it on that kind of cultural level.
Do you feel optimistic about the way the culture is changing to be more open and welcoming of this? Or
It's so hard to know. You
yeah,
know, it's like we live in this time of like such polarization, right? It's like you can look at, you know, some young folks and be like, oh my goodness, the whole thing is being dismantled. It's wonderful. You know, like so many young people are so much more politically engaged as well and are saying it's all way more complex. But then there's these big backlashes against it. And also, you know, we see obviously what's going on in the world politically, and that social media really encourages this kind of polarizing as well, of opinion, and that real kind of us and them, you know, trying to fix ourselves as this one thing against something else. So, and obviously the way, you know, climate crisis and the way we're treating the planet is kind of the ultimate kind of endpoint of this particular way of being that's so prevalent right now. So it's super hard to feel optimistic at this time. Yeah.
and I suppose no matter how passionate, like how passionate the drive to be making changes, there's also an equally passionate force of wanting to hold on to traditional
Yeah. values.
And so no matter, even if I guess I'm seeing it a bit like a picture, but no matter, even if a lot of the world becomes, I'm seeing it like very colorful and very open, this, you're still going to have people very, very strongly making the same trajectory of not being open, I guess, and not being welcoming and being hostile.
and there's so many forces, together to kind of pull us in that direction. If we think about, again, what existentialism Buddhism is saying, they're saying like, actually the whole human condition makes us more likely to fix ourselves and others, and to avoid these realities and to just try and get what's nice for us, at whatever cost to anybody else. Like that, if that's the human condition, if it's also our culture is trying to make us do those things in order to buy lots of products and spend lots of money, and and then a lot of that is passed on intergenerationally, so we see the kind of level of trauma in families, which also kind of pushes us in those directions, our bodies and brains to be much more binary thinking and very frightened, and trying to constantly kind of protect ourselves. That doesn't add up to a great situation, but again, we see popularity of the mindfulness movement, existential ideas certainly being, pretty popular still. That there is the yearning for something different. Certainly things like Black Lives Matter that are, raising all of these issues in the area of race, Me Too movement. It's so hard to say a sense of like a march of progress or we're all falling apart, as existentialism Buddhism was both say. It's always both. It's like things are falling apart and they're coming together, and they're falling apart and they're coming together again constantly.
And I suppose this is exactly where your contributions, the writings that you're doing, the advocacy that you're doing, the speaking that you're doing is incredibly valuable, because I suppose in a way we can only become familiar with what we are exposed to. If we are born into a culture which says this is what it is, it's either or like this, then how can you, apart from just intuitively feeling that it's wrong, which I suppose is perhaps my experience, something was wrong, but I didn't have anywhere to tell me what options were.
Yeah. And that's really my passion, is like, how can we make sure that everybody has access to these ideas? Because, love existentialism, however much you do, it ain't easy. It's not like these ideas are not really filtering down to the general population, but how can we ensure that they do in a way that people could actually access and that could like really resonate with their lived experiences? Because I don't think they have to be that complex. Actually I think you give the right examples, you put them across in the right format, you get rid of all the big words and all the hyphens, and there really is a potential for people to grasp it really well, actually, because it's their experience, so it's just it's going to resonate. And I just think to get those ideas out there so people have some bit of a route map, like, again, my work, it's like, how can we then like help people practice this in a daily way, rather than just like, here's the ideas, but what kind of life can people live then with these kind of ideas in it.
Do you feel that there have been times of your own life where these ideas have been very particularly helpful then?
Hugely, yeah. I mean, I think, mental health struggles, like I've had a few periods of, including quite recently, of sort of what would be labeled post-traumatic stress. And I think, this kind of just to know what's going on, to have that kind of story to tell of like, okay, this is what's happening. It's so hard not to do it. It's like, I am, grasping these particular things that are going on in my life and making them into something much more painful than they need to be, because because it's so hard to sit with that anxiety of being. It's so hard to let go of the strategies that I've kind of built up to try and survive in this world, to realize, oh, actually it's those strategies that have been doing me the damage. I need to let go of them. But when you let go of them, what have you got left? So to have these kind of stories from existentialism and from these other ideas to help me, like, oh, this is what's happening, and and it's gonna feel really hard, and it is really painful stuff that you're confronting. And I think particularly in the area of relationships, which is one of the areas that I write on the most, I find Sartre and de Beauvoir stuff incredibly helpful on this, because they're saying human relating is really difficult. They're not you go to the self-help books, and it's all, it's easy, you should have these naturally wonderful relationships, stay together forever, be happily ever after, that's the dream we're being sold. And I guess, Sartre and de Beauvoir are saying that is utter crap. Relating between human beings is impossibly hard because we're always trying to make someone into something for us, or trying to become something for them. That's one of our main survival strategies, or ways of avoiding existential anxiety. And when you have that, it's like, oh, phew, thank goodness. And you can start to see how you do that and how other people are doing that to you. And it normalizes it, makes it kind of more like, again, bearable. I think that it is that hard, and that they've got it, that it's appropriately understood as being really hard. And then I think, Simone de Beauvoir particularly is offering us an alternative, which is, how about if we related to people, embracing their freedom, and like it's this kind of mutual relating, whereas if they embrace our freedom and we embrace theirs, we're going to have a more trusting relationship. We're also going to be able to support each other in our projects. And again, we can then start asking these really, important and complicated questions about how do we relate like that, and what kind of microcultures and systems can support us in relating in those ways, rather than constantly being, trying to make the other person into a thing for us, or trying to be a thing for them.
Every client that I've seen for the whole of this week indeed has brought the theme of relationships, whether that's coincidentally or probably not, because like you said, it's such a massive theme in our lives. I'd love to give more space here for you to share kind of some of the insights that you've gained, maybe any of these surprising insights or the most powerful ones, of especially why relating with others, it's something that we can desire so much, but it can be the most confusing, the most painful.
Absolutely. And I think, that framework from existentialism helps me a lot. And then if you bring it together with the trauma literature, I think it's really helpful, because, this kind of concept of developmental trauma is basically that, as I guess that we do this to kids as well, and that doesn't give them, we're learning this kind of way of relating very early on, and it's kind of being put on our kind of bodies and brains. Because when adults are treating kids as kind of belongings or as things, they're giving them the message, if you're like this, you get love, and if you're like this, you don't, for example. So that's where you're learning these kind of survival strategies for that become these fixed parts of your identity. So trauma literature would say, things like fight and flight and fawn, become our whole way of being. Because if we learn as a kid, that if we sort of try and control people, and if we tell people off and get angry with people, that gets us what we want, the sort of love and the safety, then we're going to do that, and that's going to become quite fixed. Or if we discover that people pleasing, so that's how we kind of come to then these quite fixed ways of relating. And of course, if we don't get those kind of fundamental needs met as children as well, then we enter adult relationships, still looking for the things that we lost or we lacked as a kid. And I think that's where we then objectify others so often into oh, this person's going to be my rescuer, this person's going to finally be the person I feel safe with, this person's going to love and care for me in the ways that I always wanted. And so again, sort of looking outside ourselves for those things that we didn't get. And then, I think again, from the existential literature plus that trauma literature, we can learn about practices where we can start to develop the more complex fullness of ourselves, rather than becoming sedimented in those particular ways of being. And once we can sort of do that, then we can hopefully engage with others similarly and in sort of all that they are, rather than trying to fix them as particular parts of them for us. And this is where I really like Mick Cooper, who writes a lot about existential therapy, is also really into this idea of plural selves, and has written really well on that. And this sense of, our plurality, rather than being this fixed single thing, I think can really help us here, that if we understand ourselves as having all these different parts to us, that instead of just foregrounding one of them, we can bring that whole complexity to ourselves and our relationships. And if we can see other people like that too, then yeah, again, we're less likely to sort of just fix them and see them as this one thing for us, and also less likely to do that to ourselves.
I remember someone years ago, I don't know if they told me or I kind of stumbled upon this idea that we kind of seek that one intimate other, generally speaking, and that person should fulfill so many of our needs.
Yes.
And it's totally ridiculous if you think about how complex each individual is.
Yeah, completely, and impossible as well. They're supposed to be like our perfect lover forever, like our cohabiting co-parent, the person who looks after us when we're sick, but also the person we have fun with, and also like our best friend and our cheerleader, and also the person it's just there's no way. And that's again really recent. Before we did not look to one romantic partner to do all of those things. Back when people had much more faith, they'd be looking more to their faith for some of that stuff, and lived in communities, they'd be looking to community for some of that. So yeah, it's really recent and really problematic. And again, that's where culture like hypes up this thing that's already in the human condition, according to existentialism, to turn people into a thing for us. The wider cultures just encourage us to do it even more, particularly partners and also children, that they must become this perfect thing for us. And that then that degree of objectification is causing way more pain. And also that, then relationships are breaking down and really struggling. And then we're left again with the toll that takes, that, all of these relationships that we're getting into to try and make things better are actually making things worse, So it behoves us to really think like, what's a different way that we could be relating? And of course, Sartre and de Beauvoir tried so many different ways of relating over their lifetime, which fascinates me. I've written a chapter on, all the different kinds of monogamy and polyamory and things that they tried, albeit that they weren't called that back then. And the sort of insights that came from their explorations, I think, in terms of how we might relate better.
I suppose even the opportunity to explore comes, you have to be willing and ready and feeling safe to be able to explore.
Yeah.
And you have to be in a culture as well that is going to respond in a way that allows you to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, I think that's where, for me, de Beauvoir has it over Sartre, because I think she really got that, her ideas about how women just weren't as free as men, and then working class women and Black women weren't as free as sort of middle class white women. Like, there's that sense of who really has the freedom, in our culture to do those kind of explorations. Yeah.
I suppose we can't change the culture that we're in necessarily. I mean, we can make our contribution, but we can't in it to an extent. We have to understand this is what I'm with, but we can work on our own experience of freedom and our own experience of what is right for us.
We can, but I think, a couple of pieces around that is, again, the kind of neoliberal capitalist culture we're in, it sells us this idea that we could, do self-improvement and we could make better ourselves regardless of the world around us. And again, it comes back to, well, we're relational beings. That's a hell of a big ask. Actually, we really need relationships and systems that support us. I don't think it's realistic to expect an individual person to be able to do that without, relationships and system support. So we do need to at least kind of think about our micro level kind of communities and how we can, again, I guess what Sartre and de Beauvoir were doing with their kind of all the people they hung out with back then, they were trying to create a kind of micro culture that did things differently. And we do need that. And also, again, I come back to Black feminism of like, until everybody's free, like nobody's free. So it's not really about like, can we just get freedom for this little, sort of privileged group of people? But actually, it's like, we do need to turn back to wider culture and say, these are the things you're doing really badly. This is the impact they're having on actual, people's lives, and certainly on the level of suffering people have. Yeah.
Because the people that I meet who are compelled to change, and I suppose perhaps I am one of them, you notice something like society and feel that is so much wrong with it, but taking on the challenge of I am going to change society is way too big, and it's you feel helpless, hopeless. But that is something I've realized recently, is it's not you know, you're not going to immediately change the entire culture, but you can change your little culture, and then no doubt that will have an overlap, and you'll bump into another little culture, and slowly this is how things change, maybe.
Kind of ripple effect. It's quite complicated, isn't it? Because at the same time, I think people get this really like global, like that overwhelm of like there's just too many things, you know, there's all these intersecting oppressions that are happening, and how on earth could we possibly engage with them all? And you're completely right, it's quite good then to just really focus on, you know, who are the people in my life who are like-minded, where we can kind of just create some kind of community of support, you know, some kind of different ways of doing things. But at the same time, we do have to kind of focus outwards and be really mindful of those, you know, injustices that are going on everywhere, and not just stay in our, you know, safe little bubble kind of thing. And it's, I don't know, something about, again, dialogue in between that kind of micro and macro, and also being aware of where we're at a specific point in time, I think, of what we're capable of. You know, I think there's so many kind of guilty ideas of what is a good life and what we should be doing, that again we can get so swamped by all of that, rather than being like, where am I at right now? This is a time actually where I need to go back and do some of this personal work, you know, because I'm recognizing that I am kind of harming other people and myself by the ways I'm interacting with them. Or this is a time when actually I've got a lot to offer, I've done all that learning, and I can turn back outwards more and offer it, you know, out there in whatever kind of practical ways or kind of more emotional ways.
That's such a valuable point, isn't it? Even how you were saying earlier, there's this, the writer wants to write, but the person also knows that they need to give themselves some space, and know where we are starting from. That doesn't mean that we're no longer passionate and that we're, you know, being sinful to our endeavors, but sometimes we have to, we always have to start from the reality of where we really are.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think, you know, existentialism is encouraging us to be really honest, you know, about where we are and what we're doing. And that feels vital. I just think it also needs to be kind of balanced with kindness, because I think that kind of honesty is probably impossible unless we can treat ourselves kindly. And I think I really get that from Buddhism, that sense of like, we need this cradle of kind of kindness to do this sort of work. And I think, you know, one of the things existentialism can do is tip into this quite harsh, you know, wake up, you know, sort of shaking people to wake up to the realities of life. And it doesn't work that way. I would say it only works if we can meet people where they are, you know, and if we can be incredibly kind with ourselves and each other about how hard this is, you know, that it's not just a matter of saying, hey, treat people in the eye that way, you know, and wake up to the fact you're going to die, you know, like embrace your freedom and make meaning of your life. Like, just do it. Come on. What are you waiting for? You know, it's like these things are impossibly hard.
Would you have like a message to give someone that might be watching this video and experiencing something really challenging? Like, how can these existential ideas help someone that is experiencing stuckness or pain? Or
that's a really good question. I mean, honestly, I think when you're in it to that level, it is just about trying to be as kind with yourself as you possibly can, and take each day as it comes, you know. And I guess it's sort of trying not to, there's so much temptation to judge yourself again, to make yourself into a thing then that is getting it wrong and being bad and, you know, falling apart, and trying to see it as like, actually, you don't, you know, try not to fold in against yourself like that. It's like, this is the experience that it is now. And that because of, for all these reasons, it is really hard. So if you're struggling in some ways, you know, something that was really helpful for me was thinking like, okay, yeah, this is appropriately hard, you know, you're trying to do this work and it is really, really painful, or you're trying to engage with the world and it is really hard. So it's not, there isn't a problem here. And if you almost like, if you can relax around the edges of it and realize this isn't a problem, it's okay to be experiencing this much fear or shame or anger or whatever it is, then you can kind of be with it, and it's just really hard to describe. But that was the feeling for me of like, when all that extra layer of kind of judging myself for it and giving myself a hard time for it and wishing that I was someone else or somewhere else or anything but here, when I could just sort of like loosen around that and be like, it's okay to be like this, that really, really helped, and then just being with the experience as it is, and just trying to notice where you're trying to put more on top of it and just coming back, it's like actually often that experience of pain, if you can really just like experience it in your body, how it is to be that anxious or to feel that shame or to feel that pain, it's not as bad when you can kind of loosen and relax around it, and maybe it has something to tell you, maybe there's some important things to learn from it when you can kind of just really be with it and welcome it instead of like fighting against it.
And these are such inspiring words and probably so generalizably applicable. I'm wondering also specifically with relationships, do you have a message that would?
For me, I think we spend a lot of time looking for the right person or the right kind of way of doing relationships, like, oh, I'm not going to be monogamous, I'm going to try polyamory instead, or and actually I think it's about how we relate to other people, everyone. So in a way, getting away from this sort of like, oh, focus on romantic partners or whatever, or away from this focus on finding the perfect friend, or and it's like, really putting all that energy into like, how do we relate with others? And again, going back to de Beauvoir, that sense of like, how can we make sure that we are really embracing one another's freedom, that we're actively trying to support the people in our lives to do what's best for them, and then noticing the ways that we relate that block that, that when we do seem to try and want somebody to be something for us, or whether we're looking to someone to validate us all the time or wanting more from them than they can give, whatever, noticing those patterns, again, not like harshly judging ourselves, but noticing when they show up, and ideally cultivating relationships where we have those conversations. We can talk about that between us. So, I realized that, I fell into wanting you to, be, something for me that maybe you don't want to offer, or I realized I was getting really judgmental about how the way you do things because I want you to be like me. And you can kind of notice those things between you, and kind of keep steady on this course of like, what we're trying for here is this more mutual supportive way of relating with each other that embraces each other's freedom.
And I think you did mention it there, but I noticed so much judgment about this, about how others are behaving and the frustrations that causes, but about ourselves and the way that we are. People comparing themselves to maybe a previous relationship, or to a parent that they didn't like, or to a story, and kind of either maybe often demonizing themselves in the story of their relationship.
Absolutely. And it's sort of, again, quite a nuanced piece to be, again, up for the honesty of looking back over your relationships and seeing the kind of strategies that you're employing, and being really open with yourself about, like, I've been doing this and it hasn't been working very well for me or anyone else, but without that extra layer of like, I'm a terrible person. So that's what I try and do in my work, is to alleviate that, A, by telling people like how much I mess it up, so hopefully they realize that it is really hard, but also B, by saying like, look, when we understand that existential stuff in play here, the cultural stuff in play here, the stuff we're bringing from our childhoods here, the way that's engraved on our bodies and minds, we're up against it. It is going to be really, really hard to relate to human beings in the way that we really want to. And shifting those patterns is going to bring us face to face with really painful emotion. And so it's a lot about, how can we learn practices for being with the painful feelings, rather than turning away from them and going back to those old strategies.
And I suppose also trusting you. We were speaking about trust, but trusting ourselves, and because I think we know what feels right. We know when we encounter another person that actually really makes us feel safe and really sees us and embraces us for ourselves. But there's a sense, I get a sense that people often kind of resist that or push through that, and they wish they find themselves in a dangerous or an unsafe or an uncomfortable, and then but they force their way in there.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think, again, this trauma literature is really helping me to get my head around that, again, if we're not brought up in ways where we're trusted, and we're taught how to trust our own feelings. And, when we're maybe repeatedly we're put back into emotionally or otherwise dangerous situations, we're taught to override, and I think, again, Western culture really teaches us to override our feelings and push through, do things that don't feel okay, in terms of capitalism and work, for example, but in lots of areas. It's all about coming back to a bit more trust in our lived experience, and that's why I like the kind of R.D. Laing stuff, which is, seeing people behave, seeing patients behave in quite, striking, confusing ways. And instead of going in with that, it's not real, trying to convince somebody that the voices they're hearing aren't real, for example, or labeling someone's behavior as, self-sabotaging, and we just try and get them to stop. It's like, we understand this is sensible. We just assume it's sensible, and it's like finding out, how is it sensible for this person? How is it meaningful for them? And again, treating ourselves like that. It's like, okay, suddenly out of nowhere, I'm feeling really panicky. Instead of judging myself for that and giving myself a hard time, and wondering what the hell's wrong with me and all of this, I can just trust something's going on. And maybe I don't know yet. Maybe I don't know for the rest of today, but something strikes me tomorrow and I'm like, oh my God, that's what that was about. It did make sense. Or, maybe it never makes sense, but I can at least just be really kind around it, that on some level I know that it's a sensible response,
Rather than, I'm fighting again, I'm always like this, there's something wrong with me, I always bring the negative into the relationship. Say, obviously something is hurting me right now, and I suppose maybe giving you some of that, some time and space and focus and attention, rather than external, or the relationship or your next job or the bus ride, or to actually be with yourself through that process and work out what's going on.
Exactly. And again, I think our culture just doesn't encourage that at all. Like, most people don't spend any time with themselves and are actually really frightened of being alone with themselves, because they've got, all of these years of avoiding pain, I guess. So there's a lot, that might come up when they are alone with themselves, and I think, I would really like to see a cultural shift towards more encouragement of solitude and nurturing our relationships with ourselves. And again, existentialism is one of those approaches, which is like, I don't know if there's actively in existentialism much about solitude or the necessity to be with oneself. And there's not so much as in Buddhism of the practices of how you might do that. But there is that general sense of we need to sort of examine our lives. And of course, we're going to need time and space to do that. And again, it's about how can we enable that for ourselves and also for other people, to make sure everybody, has that's seen as part of life, is learning how to be with yourself, and having space to reflect. Yeah.
And indeed, I was going to ask you, with your delightful melange of Buddhism and existentialism, would you have it? Maybe it seemed a silly question, but I am asked it a lot from my clients. How can we be with ourselves? I think people don't know.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard. If you haven't done it, I guess again, maybe the trauma world would suggest it a little bit at a time, actually, if it's not something you're familiar with, if it is going to bring up. And there's some really good stuff about, again, sort of Buddhism has this kind of simple answer of meditation, I guess, or the mindfulness movement have certainly got really into this, actually encouraging people to spend, even like half an hour alone with themselves, if they're not familiar with that, or what might happen is all that you notice is all these painful feelings you've been repressing, or these churning thoughts that are incredibly scary. So there's something about taking it slow, and learning gradually, and also what works for you, like not feeling like just because this is how this particular audio says you should do it, or this particular rider. It's like much more like what works for you, and people may already have in their lives things that they find that they're really relaxed by watching water, for example, or they really like solitude in the form of journaling. They find if they write stuff down, it really helps them. Or maybe they've got neurodiversity of a kind that means that stimming, or having some kind of sensation is helpful, while they're alone with themselves. It's just really trusting something about yourself that does have that wisdom, that does know. And it's sort of like you're trying to just uncover that. And as soon as you get into like, no, this is the way I should do it, and I'm gonna meditate for 15 minutes every morning, even though I loathe it, it's like, that's not the way. You're only going to keep doing something as well if it's if it is feeling nurturing, even if it is somewhat painful, that it feels like it is being good for you. Not that you're just trying to force yourself to do this thing out of an obligation or because somebody said you should.
Yeah. And I think you make the really great point there that we know about what feels right for us, and know we can have other suggestions. It's that beautiful balance, I think, of being creative, being curious, experimenting, see what is right, whether that is going for the walk, or I came across a friend of mine had wax burners, and so it's just like you light a tea light and then there's colored wax, and the scents, and I found that was so powerful for me to just totally change my experience of that moment. But
because our bodies are all different. So again, depending on our level of disability, some of those things might be accessible to us or not, or which sensation. Like some of us are much more visual or much more auditory. So again, it's not a one size fits all. It's like, what's the thing that you need in order to slow down and feel that spaciousness around being by yourself. And it might change over time. Sometimes in your life it might be much more of a proper self-examination, self-reflection. Other times it might be you just need to make some gaps to just slow down and be with yourself and not try and do anything with it.
And I suppose we can frame it also in the context that we've been speaking about not holding on to what we've kind of created as concrete. Just because we've habitually walked into a house and turned the light switch on and lived in that bright light of a room, mix it up, put on a lamp in the corner and see how that sensation, be creative. We don't have to be in the same space in the same way all the time just because
I know. And it's so tragic, isn't it? Again, that these very things that are supposed to help us often do become, again, a hindrance because we relate to them in those ways. It's like, and I get it, because I've just been through such a painful time, and it's like, I'll hit on something one week that works, and it's like, oh God, this routine is working. I'm actually feeling a bit less, agonizing pain constantly. And then it's like the next week, try and do the same thing. Oh God, it's like that isn't the thing anymore. It needs to keep adapting because we keep changing, and being up for that adaptation, rather than fixing like, oh, these are the things that work, I have to keep doing those all the time. And again, it's always a sort of like, there's a nuance to it of like, it can be really useful to find these rhythms and rituals that really ground us, that enable us to do this work. And it's also good not to hold them too tightly, because if we hold them too tightly, like that might not, we may need to adapt them over time.
Maybe it's about like creating cultivating a kind of a selection box, so we have these resources, and that might work really well for that day or that week. And it's not to say, oh no, it's never going to work again, but to say, okay, I now know it's there to revisit, but is there anything here that is now feeling right, or do I need to go exploring more and find more? And
that's exactly how I do it now. It's like there's a toolkit of these kind of practices that really generally work quite well for me. and it's tuning in on that particular day or that particular moment, and being okay with that. Yeah, like my health may go up and down because I have some chronic fatigue, and my level of distress might go up and down. So I can kind of tune in on particular moments as well, of like almost like a traffic light system, am I red, amber, or green? If it's red, I need to do those, real grounding ones that are just about bringing you back to the moment and your body and orienting to your surroundings. If it's an amber, then it's like maybe some self-talk or some journaling or something is steadying. But if it's green and I'm feeling really quite open, that might be the going out for the long walk or or a long meditation where I'm just with my experience, or just allowing yourself to do that curious play, and then find the ones, and then allowing it to be a bit flexible over time. So again, it's you're tuning into yourself. You're really learning a kind, honest relationship with yourself by being open in that way, and enabling yourself to go to what's actually going to help.
Getting to know yourself in this kind of curious and kind and compassionate way, rather than assuming that you are who you are, and
which is the best thing we can do for our relationships with others as well, I think, because the more we know ourselves, the less we're likely to be going to those relationships trying to get something that we're missing, or we're coming from the place of those wounded parts of ourselves that we haven't addressed. So I think it is better for everyone and better for the world, because we're going to be better resourced to deal with the tough stuff that happens in our day-to-day life.
I feel that this is so powerful to listen to, and I feel that so many people hopefully might watch this and kind of just reflect and hopefully forgive the way they've related in other relationships. I think it's very easy to be like, oh, I've had a repertoire of bad people, or such a normal thing to hear. Oh, well, me, I pick bad people. And it's like, well, forgive that part of yourself, forgive that version of yourself which happened to need that, or look for it was lacking.
I think this is a huge space for forgiveness here of ourselves and others when we recognize what it is we're up against, again, on all of these levels. That it just is really hard to do this stuff, and we are going to get it wrong and fall over. I love, there's a lovely quote from Emmy van Deurzen, and I've just put in this book about that, to be imperfect is exactly what humans are, and instead of constantly fighting against our imperfection, once we turn around and embrace our imperfection and lack, and recognize that is what it is to be human, and in a way that, to have this idea of wanting to be complete and perfect is like wishing for death, because the only time we're complete is when the full stop goes at the end of the final chapter of our life. I think that's really helpful.
When the suffering that we are hating upon ends.
When we're wishing for it to end, it's like that. That's the only time it is gonna. But I also get how terrifying that is. Is actually it's existentialism is saying that it's at times absolutely terrifying to live, and to just know that all these things are going to keep coming at you, and that you are going to experience these feelings over and over again, that they're not, that this thing that this kind of day that you wish for, where you wake up and everything's fine and you finally got it, is never going to come. Doesn't matter how much you're a Buddhist or this just really feeling okay with yourself completely is like the definition of enlightenment. And most of us are probably never going to get there, so it is going to be this, but it's also none of those things are going to last forever. The pain isn't going to last forever either. If we can again embrace life in this kind of much more fluid, flowing way, everything will begin and everything will end, and that will keep happening until it is finally over.
I think a lot of the time we don't notice when it is all fine and dandy as well. Get to that place, we accomplish all our tasks, we get the house and the car and the job and the partner and the this and the that and the thing, and then we're still seeking that sense of, oh, I must add more. Then this is where Buddhist philosophies are super influential. I'm starting to panic or be angry or frustrated, then I'm like, hey, hold on, look around. Hey, you could always have more, but whoa, look what you've got. You're healthy, you've got this, you have this, you're looking for. It's like, whoa, slow down, look what you have.
Yeah, I guess it's that piece about, always being in the future and the past and struggling to sort of be in this moment. Um, again, we're really sold that message that we should constantly be striving for more and better. So we just can't notice when we're in a moment of enoughness. And, I guess the enlightenment piece, the where, you might potentially get to after lifetimes of studying this stuff is that you can just be in this present moment and open to it, without all of that like past baggage and all of that sense of like wishing to be somewhere different or worrying about what the next moment's going to bring.
So for someone who was curious to explore, I know you were saying that you're writing comics as well, so it's not just someone that might be interested in exploring existential ideas but might not want to go down the big like original text or go to a training academy. What other routes towards these ideas might be available to people?
So I guess I like quite a lot of the people who also wrote novels. So Irvin Yalom, has written quite a number of novels and also case studies that are quite readable for anyone. So I think, he's a really good place to start. Like there are so few who write just for a general audience, but he is one who does. But I do really find Sartre and de Beauvoir's novels and plays quite approachable. So No Exit, is this real classic play by Sartre about, how we treat each other. And that's quite accessible. And I think Simone de Beauvoir, like All Men Are Mortal, really gets into this idea of what it is to, what would it be like if we were immortal, and how important it is to actually be mortal. And also her books She Came to Stay is really good on, again, human relationships. There is a novel, I think, by Sarah Bakewell, At the Existentialist Cafe, which is all about, have you read that?
I haven't read it, but
I haven't yet.
Spinelli yesterday, and he suggested the same.
Yeah, so I think that would be, again, a good way in for some more recent person who's written fictionally about these folks. I really like that movie I Heart Huckabees as well, which is, kind of about the existential detectives. And then The Good Place, that Netflix show, is it's not all existentialism, it's kind of all philosophy, but really, some really nice, easy stuff in there. If you're interested in existential therapy specifically, then I think Spinelli and Van Derzen both do write really accessibly, but also Mick Cooper and Darren Langdridge, they've both written books about existential therapy as a whole, which are really, again, really easy ways in, I think, personally.
So valuable, so inspiring. I'm aware of the time. Was there anything before we come to the close of the interview that you would like to add?
Just I guess my own stuff, there isn't anything that I've written apart from a few chapters that are specifically existential. But if people are liking the ideas they've heard from me, if you just go to my website, rewritingtherules.com, it shows you all the different books. And the mental health graphic guide I'm currently writing will have quite a bit of existentialism in, but that probably won't be out till maybe the end of next year, 2022.
Very exciting, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time to be here today and to share these ideas. It's been such a pleasure.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thanks for including me.
Not at all. Thank you so much.